initiative. This is an initiative which most of you also know to sort of document, record, and discuss the significant global connectivities among both historically and in contemporary Asia of Asian societies. The rationale being that, we've learned a lot of our categories and developed a lot of our categories from kinds of bilateral understandings between the Asian society studied and its European colonial power or whatever from the northwest of Europe. And that we may actually, so as a result, they may not be the best. They're certainly very useful. I have nothing against them, but they may not be the best way to understand Asian connections, which have existed for long historical periods, and recently their histories are perhaps their connectivities are maybe more significant than, and parallels may be more significant than those in the more developed Europe. Incidentally, just as an aside, my internet sometimes becomes unstable, in which case go ahead and I will join on another computer. Hopefully it doesn't today, but it has not been behaving very well. So what GAI does is focus on, of course, many different issues, but we are a hub of the Social Science Research Council Inter-Asia Study Program for environmental history, environmental humanities, and in particular, we've been doing a lot of work on water. And we typically have a lot of events. Some people think maybe too many, especially when Yen was here. But we had planned some which got canceled, and one in particular that was relevant for this. Several of the people who were involved with that are also here now. That was a plenary session in the Association for Asian Studies meeting on water, and I think Rohan and Chris Courtney were the organizers. Yen was a presenter, and it was on irrigation versus inundation, and I forget the exact title, but that didn't happen, and several other things didn't happen. But we have continued to some extent. We did a program with Sunil Amrit and others in September on climate and history in monsoon Asia. It was very well attended. We had over 200 people, and so this is, of course, an SSRC sponsored one of the last events that the Inter-Asia program is sponsoring. Incidentally, those of you who have been involved in Inter-Asia will know that there are 3 or 4 last events of Inter-Asia happening right now, including one in Singapore, where, and I heard yesterday the keynote speech of Anna Singh, who did a very interesting presentation on her new work on the fishers and raiders of the Sulawesi region and the sea region, those who came to be known as the boogeyman, right? And how they developed their own notions of value under the European country trade. And so very interesting, as you would expect from her. And she kept referring also, by the way, Debojyoti, to the Sundarbans and its parallels with the continuities, as it were, on how these deltaic regions and these island communities work. So we also have, for a general announcement, a talk coming up next month, which is by, not on water, but on a very contemporary issue by Vasana Wongsurawat of Chulalongkorn University, speaking on the movement in Thailand. She's got a book coming out. I don't know how long she will survive, called "The King and the Communists," and looking at China and the royalty and the royal classes and so on. So that would be very interesting. We'll advertise it in good time. I'm sure several of you will be interested. You now know the procedure for the webinar. It is each paper will be read or presented, presumably with a PowerPoint or not, for half an hour. And then there will be a couple of minutes break, and then the next session, and then with the discussant, and we reserve the last half hour for discussion. Okay, so let's begin. Sucheta, you're going to take it on from here. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Apparently, that's the most common word being said these days in the world. You're muted.
You're muted. Yes. Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to really welcome Yan Gao, who has been here for a while at Duke, and we are old colleagues in some ways since you were here and met. And then but I think the sequence that I have on my schedule is that you start with your presentation, Yen, and then I follow with the comments, right?
Yeah.
So as part of the Global Asia Group, which and nothing to distract from what amazing work Prasenjit has done, we had started this initiative on Global Asia here with UNC at one point, and then very fortuitously, Prasenjit decided to come to Duke from Singapore. And I was ever so happy to land Global Asia in his lap and move on to my own projects. So with that, we have really had a very, very lively exchange on water. And this is the 20th century, was the century of petroleum. The water wars and the challenges of water are what we are focusing on with the 21st century. So with that, let me just turn to Yen and have her presentation, and then I'll follow with some comments on Mingqing, China.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Prasenjit, and thanks, Sucheta. And it's really a privilege to be here to present the paper. And I'm Yan, and I worked with Prasenjit 1.5 years ago, I think. And it has been some time. So my work is not exact.
When they have more efficiently established power over the Jiangnan region, whereas the 17th century as a contested space of the Jiangnan area, where we have the Dongling Academy, we have all the last remnants of the Ming Dynasty, how that changes this relationship would be very exciting to hear a little bit more about, whether if you were to develop this paper further. What I found very enriching in your discussion and presentation was the attention that you bring to how the Manchu are changed and their banner practices and everything is changed by moving to Jiangnan. And they have to deal with their horses dying on them. And we forget how important horses were in all pre-modern economies. And there is the British colonial officials of the 19th century worrying that their wars with Afghanistan means that the horses from Afghanistan are not going to come into India, because India too has the same problem as the Jiangnan region. So referring to the monsoon region's problems with horses, this remains a very, very crucial link why neither Qing China nor Mughal India can do without the connections with Central Asia. The centrality of Central Asia, even when you're as far away as the Jiangnan. So the Qing, of course, have their horses constantly being brought in from Mongolia down to uh, the Jiangnan, and the horses keep dying, and there's a whole literature on that. And I'm so appreciative of your bringing that into focus in our conversation, the importance of how animals decided so many of human activities. The other aspect which you defer to in your paper, but you, for a shortage of time, of course, couldn't go into here, but I found very helpful to understanding who the people are, the Jianmin, the mean people as they're called, and the landscape of this region where so much silt is brought down and constantly new islands are formed reminded me very much of the literature I have heard, because I have not visited what was my family's homeland down in Barisal and Dhaka and that whole region, where the Meghna River, or Brahmaputra's branches, bring down this enormous amount of sand, and new islands are constantly formed. So that the modern states all across from the Bay of Bengal out to Jiangnan are constantly trying to fix these sandbars into islands and prevent the random ways in which fisher people would live on the boats and live on land. And that, I think, is something very challenging for all political centers, Beijing, Delhi, whoever it is, and even Dhaka. And so right now, the projects of reclaiming those lands and turning them into real settled.
So
Hi,
I cannot hear.
now we can, we cannot hear you, Sucheta.
Yeah, we
Oh,
cannot.
now, okay.
Mm,
Yeah, we are unable to hear you, Sucheta. It seems you have muted.
Perhaps you can rejoin the meeting.
I think rejoining will be good. Yes.
Okay, so while Sucheta actually was trying to rejoin, and I will quickly respond in some of the questions and concerns that she mentioned, and about my paper. That one thing is about the people, that the Jianmin was deficient. The Jianmin, the based people, was abolished in the early 18th century. Okay, and but some of the practices still continued, but the people mainly are based on the lineages and families, and there are different have different occupations as well, like fishing people, like farmers and landlords and peasants, and so there is it's kind of a whole dynamic of the landscape. So for people, that was very at the ground level. That I have a whole chapter about that, and how people are fighting and managing the resources, and what basis they're having based on the land, or how to collaborate and contribute on the dike maintenance and repairs, and how to divide among different villages. How did they negotiate on the labor contribution, on the financial contributions? Okay, so that was a very important part of the project as well. And about the sandbars, and had very interesting encounter with some of the early maps, actually. So during the Kangxi reign, there was Western cartography, and we can see some of the maps of the whole China, and at the time, the Qing China, and based on the longitude and altitude. And some of the later maps in 18th century, possibly I couldn't remember, or 19th century, that it's the map of the whole map of the Qing China, and some of the river courses, and indicated very in detail the sandbar, the locations of the sandbars in the Yangtze River. It's such a detailed map, and emphasis on the sandbars, and that is caught my attention. That was so interesting. And when the cartographers, and they are mapping the landscape and different geographic regions, the river courses, and the sandbars caught their specific attention, and they map specifically each of the sandbar where they are. And so there are a lot of ways.
Sucheta is back. Sucheta is back. So
oh, okay.
Yeah. Sucheta?
Okay. I will stop here.
Yeah. Sucheta?
We still cannot hear you, Sucheta.
We can't even see you.
Oh, she's here.
No.
We can see her now, but we cannot hear. You are muted, it says, yeah. Yeah.
No. For some reason, we cannot hear you yet.
Yes, there is a ping sign with the pin coming in with Sucheta's.
Yeah, because she's spotlighted.
I was really appreciative of Yan bringing in all this discussion about the horse and the horses, because I think we don't appreciate how the negotiations between the land and the water also involved land animals, big time. And if they can't eat seagrass, the only place where there's one variety of horses where they do eat seagrass, that's on the Camargue, south of France. And that area actually produces a particular kind of horse for this purpose, but that breed was just not available throughout Asia. So horse management becomes an important part of how we see the unfolding of these ecologically dependent histories between land and water. And I wanted to throw that in. It's not just fishermen and people who are agriculturalists, but there is this third dimension, as it were, by turning to looking at animals. And but in the same way, I was wondering how we might accommodate in this conversation the people who are neither land, who are dispossessed on land, but possess various skills and necessary means of existence by living on boats. The Danmin people of the Pearl River Delta continue to survive and flourish, and they are a very important intermediary group between the foreign traders and the locals, and they're called the boat people. there is a similar group that's constantly contesting imperial power. So the fishermen are fishermen in good times, they are pirates in bad times. And the extent to which piracy is part of this world of resistance, if we would want to use Marcus Rediker here, is an important part of reconsidering the imperial control line and the local resistance, as it were. Because the gentry also need these people who are the smugglers of the world in their local environments. So that's an interdependent setup between the dispossessed who are not allowed to move to the land fundamentally because they own no land, they have no rights to land, and the gentry who depend on them to bring in certain smuggled goods and every now and then turn them over to, so the ways in which the imperial state and then the modern state tries to pin people down into these lands is an important part of the conversation, perhaps, that we would want to return to when we get to our next wrap up, perhaps, or how we take it further, so that bringing people and animals, the dispossessed people, the marginal people, the people who live on boat and sandbars, who take to the seas when the sandbars down, that ecology and environment as both hybrid spaces and hybrid peoples and existence is what I wanted to throw into this very, very interesting and rich conversation that's happening over the next 2 days. So I see that my time is up and I will send comments. And anyway, hopefully tomorrow there'll be no glitches when we are wrapping up. So we have arrived at that moment where we want to take a break and then start with Debojyoti's paper shortly. Thank you, colleagues.
Okay, if I can just interrupt for a moment here. Thank you, Sujeta. You had also started before you got cut off to talk about how these monsoon landscapes or waterscapes produce sandbars and so on. And we can ask you those kinds of, so I mean, you know, there is a generalization that could be made beyond the Changhan Plain about these things that we can talk about perhaps during the discussion. So we'll take that up now, but let's not take up any more time from Debojyoti's presentation. Debojyoti, please start.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to kind of share the recorded presentation because of the kind of glitches that we are having. I'm not 100% sure whether if I do it kind of live, it is going to work. But before I start, I would just like to say that I'm currently based in Sussex University, and I'm currently doing a project on environmental refugees where I'm looking at issues of climate, health, and livelihood in 4 countries across the Indian Ocean region, trying to understand particularly internal migration and also map the agency of individuals who kind of are affected by different natural disasters because of climate change and also because of structural inequalities within these societies. Okay, so before I go back to my presentation, I'll ask Rohini to share my recorded presentation so that I think we cannot hear anything.
Rohini, you have to share the audio. You have to share the computer audio.
Where's that?
Let's see. I don't know if I can do it though.
Rohini, do you know how to share the, Rohini, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah.
You know how to share the audio as well?
You need to share the computer audio. I think it's on your left. No, on your right hand top, and you will see a drop down box. And from the list, you should choose share the computer audio as well. And otherwise, we couldn't hear from the
where is it
shared
again?
video.
Where is it? Is it on more, or because it's not in audio settings, maybe? No.
It's not on the audio settings, and let me see. I can share one of the audios, and I will show you.
Can I share the video with you, Yan, and you can perhaps share this screen?
Yes, please do so.
Okay. I'm sending you in chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Share screen advanced.
I cannot see actually. Let me see.
Actually,
when you choose to share your screen, it'll give you the ones to pick. And then on the right-hand side, there's a option to click advanced. And then if you go down, you can choose to share the computer audio.
but I don't see how many participants can advanced sharing options. One participant only host. I don't see an audio share in there.
Have you? So you click the green share screen.
Yeah.
Box with the arrow, and then after you click that, there should be a tab to click that says advanced, and then under that you should be able to share the computer audio.
Yeah, I don't have that option.
No, that is not there.
You don't have that option. Oh, okay.
Perhaps I don't know how to pronounce your name. Micah,
yeah.
Micah, can you try playing that link? I sent it in the chat.
Sure.
And I'll make you a co-host.
Sure. So let me just, okay, it's open now, and share screen. Right.
I've got it on. I've got it now on mine, and I could try.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the SSRC Interasia Book Writing Workshop. We had planned to meet physically a year ago, but the pandemic has warranted that we can only connect to each other remotely today through using this Zoom webinar. I'm going to quickly share with you my PowerPoint presentation before I start presenting my paper orally. So I will begin by stating how my paper links to the wider book writing project that is towards examining Borderlands as third space. By this, I mean spaces that are liminal, hybrid, ephemeral, and at the same time cosmopolitan. Looking from a distance, I will highlight the inadequacy of nationalist historiography and anthropology's portrayal of South Asian society through the prism of village studies and ways it has aligned in with area studies to produce deltas as blind spots and no-go areas. I hope to rekindle the long durée connected networks the littoral communities in the Bay of Bengal Delta have established across Asia through the Indian Ocean Circulatory Network and connected histories of lesser known littoral societies as proposed by historians such as Sanjay Subramaniam. I do not see delta environment in dualistic pigeonholes, for example, land versus water, forest versus farms, littoral versus the terrestrial, and civilized versus the wild, but one that captures the trans-regional networks and diffusion of humankind that preceded contemporary processes of globalization through circulatory histories and practices of mobility. To use Anna Singh's words, and I quote, globalization draws our enthusiasm because it helps us imagine interconnection and sudden transformation. Yet it also draws us inside its rhetoric until we take its claim for true description, unquote. Singh asks us instead to study folk understanding of the global and the practices with which they are intertwined. This paper is then an attempt to recount one such concrete set of historically situated global engagements in the Sundarban Delta, where global Islam becomes local, so to Hinduism developed by Indologists during the colonial period. It will be fair to say that the Sundarban was global much before the arrival of the East India Company and the Raj. Research in the Sundarbans and the Indian Ocean region can be imagined at least in three different registers, which I'm going to show you here. First, looking out that focuses on migration and circulation of history. For example, the longue durée understanding of historical changes that has been shaped not only by contemporary globalization processes, but pre-colonial movements of people, which I call as cosmopolitanism. The work of Nsang Ho, Sugata Bose, and Sunil Amrit speak about the trans-regional migration of goods, ideas, and commodities in the Indian Ocean world even before the arrival of the British and other colonial powers. Looking back, which is very important for my paper, focuses on how we can understand littoral societies through genealogies. In the Sundarban Delta, there is a vast repository of family-owned Puthi manuscripts that focus not only on Brahminical texts, but also subaltern myths, legends, and shamanic practices that take center stage in living with the environment. For example, the legends of Pirs and Fakirs, Islamic prophets who entered the region during the 12th century. Also looking in, which is more contemporary, focusing on literatures published in the last 70 years post 1947 by the immigrant settler population who migrated from areas like Mednipur, which are flood infested, particularly the floods caused by the Damodar, and also the people who migrated post India's independence with the partition of the subcontinent. Therefore, in this paper, I will particularly focus on the genealogical and circulatory history of the region that produced a hybrid cultural ecotone and also a third space. So to begin with, living in the Sundarban Delta is like walking the edge of a knife. The Bengal Delta is home to nearly a quarter of a billion people spread across India and Bangladesh, and is famous for its unique mangrove forest. This hybrid landscape, where the waters of the three mighty rivers, the Ganges, Padma, and Brahmaputra meet to form the world's largest bird-footed delta, is ecologically fragile and exposed to hydrohazards such as tropical cyclone, floods, and tsunami. The delta is part of a biodiversity hotspot, megafauna, that connects the region with the wider littoral world. The interconnectedness and coexistence of human communities and cultures produce diverse landscape, which can well be compared with the diversity of human geography and the notion of ecotone in ecology. Here you have a satellite imagery of the Sundarban Delta, which kind of quite clearly represents the ephemeral nature of the delta and how it is interconnected to tributaries, backwaters, rivulets with the wider landscape, which is land. In the recent past, the concept of ecotone has found a wide range of application. For example, from the world of environmental studies or landscape geography to a broad space of human geography. For cultural geographers and environmental anthropologists who have promoted the ontological turn in social theory since 1990s, the emphasis on more than human species present the cosmopolitan understanding of the relationship between nature and culture. In the context of the Sundarban Delta, I will focus on the diffusion and circulation of scribe. Kavya literature from the so-called little folk tradition of Bengal to pan-Indian great tradition, thus developing a critique of the little and great tradition that became popular within village studies in South Asia anthropology during the 1960s and 70s. I find this classification challenging because there are various versions of Ramayana and Mahabharata retold by Bengali scholars, scribe writers, and narrated by scroll performers, particularly Potachitrakars and doggerel poem singers. The diffusion between great epics and the little tradition express the liminal religiosity and syncretic religious practices of the Sundarban Delta. For example, Pika Ghosh, in her work Unrolling a Scroll Narrative, observes that the goddess Durga played a prominent role in the Bengali version of the Ramayana in behalf of Rama in her battle with Ravana. In Bengal, which has no authentic classical tradition of its own, popular culture came to be seen not merely as an archetypical other, but also as the source of as a source of a reconstituted tradition that the region could hold up as an example for India as a whole. The Sundarban Delta presents a cultural ecotone where the meeting of different social groups, races, communities, and belief systems has produced a hybrid social space reflected in people's everyday practices, such as the worship of Bonobibi, the Lady of the Forest, who belongs to the vernacular liturgical tradition but also symbolizes the concord between Hindu and Muslim pantheons in the island. As Neil Green opines, the work of Richard Etten in Bengal offers exciting possibility for deconstructing the old paradigm of Islam as a monolithic world religion and Hinduism as Sanskritized artifact of Indological tradition. The Bengal Delta, with its unique geography and ecotonic transition, has historically played the role of a passageway for trans-regional diffusion of cultures and beliefs that have produced hybrids. Here, hard borders, boundaries are absent and do not define social identities. Rather, identities are co-produced by the liminal nature of the delta's edges that is malleable and ever-changing with rising tides, cyclones, and floods, and the migration of humanity across the Indian Ocean world. The Puthi literature of the Sundarban Delta thus provide diachronic understanding of the social and political ecology of the region. The paper will feature why community beliefs and care for the environment needs to be acknowledged in the Delta to understand not only the biophysical ecotone of the region, but also the social and cultural hybridity of the place. The foundation of my anthology stands on two ideas. First, the ethics of care for non-human subjects, highlighted in Puthi literature, and secondly, the growing debate within deep ecological thinking about ecological egalitarianism and biocentrism, a move from positivist and post-enlightenment anthropocentrism. These concepts are crucial towards understanding humans' care for non-humans. The human and more than human aspect of nature cannot be seen as competing ecologies that modern shallow ecological discourse helps us to trust. The Puthi literature, for example, Bonobibi's Johornama and Manasa Mongol attend to the concept of biocentrism and ecological egalitarianism, where humans are seen as part of nature, not as a dominant and controlling or superior agent. Now, coming to the question of the importance of land over water in an amphibious ecotone, it became very popular with the colonial period, where the colonial state tried to tame the landscape. Clearly, much of the research in delta environment has been essentially on terra firma. The obsession with permanence and stable land remains unquestioned in thinking about hybridity. Such an unquestioned acceptance of land-based physical environment as the essence of landscape assemblages contradicts the fluid inheritance in the conception of hybridity. Most importantly, it undermines the post-colonial origin of the idea of hybridity, as has been highlighted in the works of Homi Bhabha and Ashish Nandi, and its association with anti-essentialism. In other words, the invocation of social nature might risk hybridity being conceptualized in absolute ways, leaning upon a mixing of two or more elements. The term, as Canzellini shows in his study of traditional and modern cultures in Latin America, involves the movement of people in and out of ways of being rather than moving from one to another in a linear fashion. This is true of the Sundarban Delta, where the Puthi literature has been appropriated by Bengali scribe writers and proponents of Dharma literature during the Middle Ages to support popular aspiration of the society, as well as elevate localized belief system to the mainstream pantheons of Hinduism. The conceptualization is closer to Baba's third space of hybridity, which is not an identity, but rather is an identification, a fluid and uncertain process of identifying with and through another object. The one-dimensional classification of little and great tradition as autonomous belief practices proposed in the ethnographies of McKim Marriott and Milton Singer through their studies among small communities in Indian villages and sacred cities like Banaras during the late 1960s and 70s established a rupture in the study of complex Indian society influenced by Orientalist and Indological thinking, as well as Sanskritization, which was not very popular in Bengal's literal environment, where people still wrote in vernacular Bengali and were participating actively in popular cultural practices. The great epics of Hinduism, such as Ramayana and Mahabharata, also find regional variation in the text, and multiple meanings are drawn out of these epics in the local context by skald painters, the Potachitrakars of Bengal. Likewise, the cultural hybridity is reflected in the contact that the literal rim has had established with the wider Indian Ocean world across West, Middle and Southeast Asia, from where Islamic influence had penetrated through peasantization carried out by peers and holy saints detached from the Mughal emperor of central India. Now, coming to the question of colonial property right in the Delta, it's about understanding how these hard borders were kind of constructed. The colonial period was a watershed in the Delta's history. They swept the Delta's hybrid landscape under the carpet by promoting a false material consciousness of waste developed out of Locke's natural rights, by dividing land and water into units of quantifiable objects for economic use. As a consequence, land reclamation gained momentum in the Bengal Delta through construction of embankments and dikes along the mangrove swamps and wet islands that were originally not designed for permanent human habitation. This brought cataclysmic change to the physical landscape of the Delta. The Cartesian dissection of land from water was driven by revenue concerns of the Bengal presidency that resulted in control of the river and its flow. The Bengal Delta soon became the great environmental laboratory to test European theories on the purpose, use, and control of nature in all its manifestation. The annual floods became more disastrous and riverbank erosion increased as a consequence of these interventions. Both the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793 and the Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Act of 1825 established absolute and permanent land rights over a fluid and transforming landscape, leading to the creation of artificial hard borders that were contested in the court of law by local owners of the land. Legal jurisdiction of land went hand in hand with engineering and techno-managerial control imposed by hydraulic experts. In this process, the fluid and the transient world of the Delta's waterscape became invisible as land became center to colonial capitalism and mercantile appropriation. The dominant notion continues to sway hold in the post-colonial period. Now, coming to the genealogical texture, now I'm exploring Bonobibi's Johannama, a 16th century text which is very popular among Sundarbans inhabitants. While the Puthi literature presents a genealogical understanding of nature and culture, these records were written and commissioned by the privileged Bengali Brahmins who introduced the Dharma worship by adopting local gods into the wider ambit of Hindu fold. For example, the eulogization of Manasha, the goddess of serpent, in the Manasha Mongol, as you can see here in this photograph that has been digitized by us for the British Library, where the Manasha Mongol has been recited. Also Sitala, the goddess of measles, and the Battle of Dakhin Rai and Bonobibi that have long been classified as folk deities. The incorporation of local Sylvian deity into the religious pantheons of Bengal itself speaks about the hybrid adaptation of village gods into the Dharma fold, thus creating a hybrid social space within the Sanskritized Hindu social order. Here I begin by examining one of the popular scribe literature of the Delta, titled Bonobibi's Johannama, a 16th century text, and chart the social geography of the diffusion of Islam and Hinduism in the Delta that has been growing interest among scholars, promoting global and intellectual history of South Asia. The text stages the dissemination of hard categories such as popular, desi, and marga as the literature spread across the Bengal Delta to capture popular imagination. It also showcases the syncretic culture of the Delta's rim that dissolved monotheism, like the turquoise water of the Delta Creek, backwaters, and sandbars that produced an ephemeral geography in a watery landscape. The vernacular literary tradition of Lower Bengal can contribute to the environmental humanities project proposed by many humanities and literary critics such as Amitabh Ghosh, the author of The Great Derangement, and Hungry Tide, as important cultural resources to understand environmentalism in the global south. The nature-culture separation proposed by expert ecologists can be examined from the standpoint of vernacular philosophy that focuses around humans' relationship with non-human, not in binary terms of conflict and encroachment of habitat, but as cohabitats where restrained access for forest vulnerable resources and control over human greed and passion sustains the ethics of conservation. The ritual of worshipping Bonobibi before entering the forest thus serves many purposes that provides not only psychological strength to forest goers and fishers, but also more centrally moral and ethical persuasion for care and conservation. Now, looking into the cult of Bonobibi, how the whole story has evolved. According to local legends, the worship of Bonobibi, the Lady of the Forest, has been in practice since time immemorial. However, in the written colonial sources, there is no mention of Bonobibi as highlighted by Shujit Shore, one of my interlocutors whom I interviewed during my fieldwork in Gosaba in 2017. Rather, the mythical charm of the Peers, Fakirs, and pioneering first settlers, locally known as Ghazi, such as Khan Jahan and Badr Ghazi Khan, among others, came up scantily in colonial accounts and treaties of officials who surveyed and administered these areas, particularly Hunter Rennell, who produced memoirs and monographs and gazetteers on the Bengal Delta. The origin of Bonobibi remains mystical and can only be traced back to Mecca and Medina through the text Bonobibi's Johannama. The narrative follows a pattern in these stories linked to the tradition of punishment and reward, where mortals are made to become devotees and followers of particular terrestrial deity. This trend can also be seen in the older form of folk religious narratives, such as the Mongol Kavya, which were composed during the period preceding the spread of Islam among the Delta settlers. According to Tirthankar Roy, these poems were composed from oral tradition of the earlier period during the late 16th and 18th century by Bengali intellectuals and writers under the patronage of local kings such as the Gaur kingdom. Therefore, they do reflect the society of that time. The folk history of Bonobibi was also localized by the Ghazi Pir, who were the patron saints of the Delta, and were following the tradition of Kavya that adopted a worship-reward metaphor in their ballads. In the Delta seaboard, as I will show in the preceding paragraphs, the global became a part of the local, and outsiders joined in the competition for assets. Reflecting on this scenario, Tirthankar Roy notes that the East Bengal ballads are full of tales on fragility and fortune. For anthropologist Sutapa Sarkar, Bonobibi was perhaps known as Bonachandi before the arrival of Sufi, fakirs, and patrons, prophets who reincarnated her as forest goddess. There are at least two stories associated with Bonobibi's Johannama, composed by the poet Munshi Badruddin during 1877-1888, and later by Muhammad Munshi Sahib and Muhammad Khate. The wide variety of authorship of these texts remains contested and cannot be fully verified, as they were written by people who left little hagiographic trace in the archives. The Bonobibi's poetry illuminates the popular origin of the deity through a mythical blessing of the prophet that gives rise to Bonobibi's charisma in the forest landscape of the Sundarban Delta. The narrative can also be interpreted as how Islam was accepted in the Delta, not in the conformist sense through patronage of the Mughal emperor, but through peasantization and the expansion of agricultural frontier in Lower Bengal, as has been highlighted in the works of Richard Etten. Now, looking at the vernacular narrative, in the first narrative, the origin of Bonobibi and her purpose of residing in the forest of the Sundarban can be traced. Bonobibi, along with her brother Shahjangli, were sent by Prophet from Mecca to settle in the Bengal Delta. The folk narrative proceeds with the imagery Bahram Fakir, who lives in Mecca and was married to Fulo Bibi, a wife who was unable to conceive. Saddened by this, Fulo Bibi insists that Bahram should visit Medina for holy prayers so that God may bless him with a child. The husband follows his wife's advice and prays to the Prophet. The Prophet becomes engrossed by his plea and, after much consultation of holy scriptures, suggests that he will have two children only if he remarries another woman. Bahram shares this dilemma with his wife after returning back from Mecca. The wife gets awestruck by Allah's foretelling but grants him permission to have a second wife with the condition that he must fulfill one wish of her whenever she would ask for it. Barams agrees to her condition and marries again, this time to Gulal Bibi, and she soon falls pregnant. As the news spreads to Fula Bibi, she gets back to her husband to keep his wish, and Gulal Bibi is banished from his life. Gulal Bibi and her two children, Bono Bibi and Shah Jangli, are left in the forest. Gulal Bibi, on Allah's command, leaves Bono Bibi to her destiny, where she is left at the mercy of the forest animals. Shah Jangli continues to reside in the forest with her sister as they took up the mission of protecting people from the tiger. The story of Bono Bibi embodies a moral overtone of the harmony that exists between humans and non-humans inside the forest, and the injunctions to enter the forest with an open heart and selflessness. To the people living in the cities and upcountry, the folk tradition of the Sundarbans present a fantasy of sort, as phantom figures brave to go deep in the jungle and risk their life for little honey when wax. While with increasing restrictions set by the forest department and the issue of boat license to regulate forest trip to the jungle, the activity is slowly becoming rare and barely support communities who live in the delta. Sundarbans tenants are followed by foresters and the baule who guide them inside the forest, particularly tiger charmers. However, these days such baules are hard to find, as all villages are connected to the city and the aspiration of materialistic life. The distinction between the forest and village lies in the harmony and equality that follows man and that fellow man and woman are supposed to share inside the forest and with non-humans, as designed by Bonobi's guiding principles of living within the forest. Therefore, Bonobi's shrine, also known as Than, is never built inside the village. They are exclusive spaces along the roads or forest where people worship the deity before venturing into their livelihood activities. Inside the village, family dispute, boundary dispute, and squabbles with relatives often attract litigation, fights, and court cases. This is quite uncommon among forest-dependent communities who have limited land holding and live by the river. In Goshaba, one of the major settlements in the delta, the Hamilton Zamindari was established in the 1930s by reclaiming forest and new settlements. Landless peasants came from many parts of Bengal, Orissa, and present-day Jharkhand to occupy land at a free rate, as Hamilton proposed to end moneylenders and intermediaries who broke the bond of landless peasants. This cooperative movement, though noble in idea, did not last long, as free men of Gosaba again became tied down to the managers of the estate, who acted as the new zamindars when Hamilton left the island for home. Soon litigation began to prop up thick and fast, and over a period of few decades, the Hamilton estate officials were piled up with court cases that nearly ran the zamindari into a state of bankruptcy. These struggles for land and property never takes place in the neighboring forest, where foresters are not allowed to hoard land resources such as honey and firewood beyond their basic needs. Whenever there is a need to stay inside the forest, people live with fear of the tiger and wild animals who become active at night. In the above discussion, we have seen how Bonobi plays a central role in the lives of forest goers and fishers in the delta. She emerges as a protector of the community who is looked upon as a deity, breaking away from religious boundaries, jati classification, and class distinction. Besides Bonobi, there are other local gods and saintly figures who are also considered to be pioneer settlers and patrons responsible for engineering social change through introduction of paddy culture. The Peed's Islamic saints played a defining role in transforming the landscape during the late 16th century. Bengali literature that flourished under the patronage of local dynasties in the form of romance, epics, and doggerel poems, preserved in palm leaf puthis, transmitted the oral popular tradition into written forms during the 15th and the 16th century. The Bonobi's Johannama was an integral part of this literary tradition, adopted by Islamic writers who came to settle in the region and propagate the message of the Prophet by adopting the style of storytelling as retold in the Kavya tradition. The only alteration came in the addition of new gods and goddesses who were now invoked as peers, fakirs, ghazis, and bibis, alongside the pre-existing deities, namely Manusha, Shitala, Chandi, and Dakshinrai. While in some popular ballads the use of Hindu and Islamic goddess coexist to form a secular world, for example, in Raimongo, we see a clear mention of Ghazi who rides on a tiger. Both the folk literature concerned the lives of the marginal man and woman who lived in the forest and littoral marshlands. The famous 19th century Bengali art revivalist Guru Shodhar Dutt divides the folk narratives into three categories: heroism, worldliness, and spiritual quest. Uh, Guru Shodhar Dutt's contemporary Ajit Mukherjee, in his work Folk Art of Bengal, published in 1946, classifies them as ritualistic, utilitarian, and individualistic. These are, though not rigid boundaries, as the folk ballads are received by village communities as a source of entertainment through popular Pala Jatra based open air theatre enactments. In all these performances, the sacred and the secular find space. As an example, the cult of Ghazi Pir, who has equal votaries like Bono Bibi in the Sundarbans, reflects not only the dual Hindu-Muslim background of the worshippers, but also the sacred secular interaction in some of the verses, as observed by Frank Cromer in one of his articles, where he talks about the Potuas of Bengal who have dual Hindu-Muslim identity. We have many other examples of such religious uniqueness that are particular and peculiar to Lower Bengal and the Delta's littoral rim. For example, such evidences can be found in the discussion on Muslim faith healers of Bengal. The idea of Bengalis native Islam comes up in the well-researched ethnographies and historical studies carried out by Ashim Roy, Tony Stewart, Ahmad Sharif, who have proposed the idea of syncretic Islamic culture in Bengal that is egalitarian and homegrown. Projit Bihari Mukherjee work on the history of Islamic faith healers reveals that Baban Gaji's invocation by Bengali Brahmin priest in Tajpur, a place located in South 24 Pargana, has played a more active role in ritualizing Baban Gaji's fame as a spiritual healer, although he finds no place in the Hindu scripture. This Mukherjee explains to be a classic case of liminal religiosity. The blending of different cultural traits in the Delta produce a distinctive cultural pattern of cosmopolitanism. Katie Gardner, in her ethnographic work on Islam in Sylhet, particularly in western part of Bangladesh, has made a very interesting point that also applies to the Delta's socio-cultural and religious pantheon. The mobile Muslim prophets have shrunk the broad division of Islam understood as binary between global and local. Instead, she proposes, through her study on the shrine of Shahjalal, how the local discourse of Islam are constructed and interpreted in Sylhet. The popular philosophy in Bonobibi offers us two perspectives. First, the folk dramatic ballad scripture is venerated by fishers and foresters through ceremonial worship and rituals that are set for practical purposes of maintaining the ethos of the forest and its use. Secondly, it also gives us an intrinsic picture on heterogeneity and liminality of religious identities. Besides this, it involves a moral world of care and conviviality where humans are seen as part of the multi-species and more than human environment. The role of the forest goers and fishers in the forest is to maintain this harmony. Bonobibi punishes those who try to exploit the resources of the forest beyond their daily day-to-day need for survival. The process of accumulation, expressed metaphorically as greed in the Johannama, explains how moderation should become the ethics of care for the environment. The taboos of the forest do not only instill fear among forest goers, but restrain them from devaluing the ethics of mutualism, which everybody benefits from the resources of the forest. The idea of purity or pavitra is also used in representational terms to restrain people from entering the forest while forest with greed and emotion that would strip the forest of its resources, much different from the conservation politics of enclosure that emerged in the late 19th century with colonial intervention. Now, coming to the final section of my presentation, I focus on the global and the local in popular culture of Sundarban. In the contemporary everyday life of Sundarban, the Bonobibi's legend has seen transmission to new territories. Globalization, not the older kind that added Bonobi's ritual status to the long list of local pantheons during the 16th century, which I will define as Islamic cosmopolitanism, has now put her in the global marketplace. The Jatra tradition of Bengal is replicated by Pala folk dramatic performances that is open for popular showcasing of local culture, organized by local tourist operators. You can see two images which kind of showcases the modern reinvention of the Pala tradition. The popular literature of the Sundarban Delta presents an intellectual history of religious and cultural encounter in the region that transformed human relationship with nature by forging the ethics and morality of forest resource use between humans and non-humans. Bengali cultural morals came to occupy a dominant place in people's lives through emulation of ballads by Muslim theologians since the 16th century. The fluid religious identity of the Delta community is reinforced by the veneration of Bonobibi, the forest goddess, and Monosha, the serpent goddess, among other vernacular gods and goddesses who derive their lineage from both religion. The folk narrative of Bonobibi thus should be seen from a wider global and local historical perspective, where the littoral has come to take a center stage. While examining why the Delta community have come to incorporate and localize both Hindu and Islamic forms of commensality and faith through the worship of the forest goddess, the answer lies in the liminality that does not represent a particular religious identity. The upsurge of Islamic fundamentalism in Bangladesh and Hindu nationalism in India, promoted by radical nationalist factions, is challenged by this unity and reverence of varied ethos in the Sundarban Delta. The Bonobibi's mythical lore has become even more relevant in contemporary period to understand South Asia's littoral society, religion, and culture. Until quite recently, deltas have been regarded as marginal. Island communities have been of secondary interest to historians and geographers. It is this moment of ecological crisis that we are rediscovering margins as complex, fuzzy, and ephemeral landscape in delta environment. I'll stop here and I will look forward to Professor Prasenjit Duara's comments and followed by question and answer soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Debojyoti. We, of course, have lost a fair amount of time, but I'm sure most people will be happy to stay on for a few minutes after 1 o'clock if the discussion continues after that. I shouldn't take too much time. First, let me say that I think this is a very rich study with interesting ideas about a third space that is both ecologically and culturally as well, an ecotone in the way that it has been discussed. I have not quite read the book by my good friend Anu Jale, The Forest of Tigers, who also has a great discussion of Bonobibi and shares many of the same concerns and interests. So there is a rich literature as well on this, and I think one can develop this into a very big project. Now, Debojyoti wants to explore the kinds of community and ecological relationship that have historically characterized the Sundarbans Delta region, and the transformations wrought upon it by the colonial and post-colonial economic epistemic formations that sought to territorialize, commodify the region, but of course, at the same time, also exercise conservation regimes, which have affected the earlier, what we can call and the ecological culture that he has described. Um, he has, I think, he has made two main points in the paper, which is that the first of which is that uh, this culture, this ecological culture, as it were, seeks to maintain the ethos of the forest, right? That is one. And it does so while developing or expanding or sustaining the heterogeneity of identities, and which also includes the multi-species identities, right? This is, of course, now a very important topic when we hear about rights of nature and human-animal relationships and so on, and the ontological turn. All of this is very interesting and useful for those projects as well. But I do think that, and since this is, of course, a book writing project, I will focus on some of the problems that I found in reading the paper, because I found it sort of to be, what should I say, not very well organized, right? So I mean, we need, so I'm trying to, my goal is to sort of, to ask you certain questions that will bring more coherence. And I can, of course, send you my comments later for you to sort of see the kinds of problems I had in the continuity and flow. And there are also some editorial problems, right? For a while, you know, although I know that Bono Bibi is a woman, at one point, I think you referred to her as a he. And so I was very confused for a little while. And then, of course, went to find out. So there are these editorial issues and so on that also will need to be, because I read it twice because you sent me 2 or 3 different versions. And I think that your presentation was very clarifying. It's also very good to have the pictures. But these are some of the issues that I had, right? So in the first place, I understand that, you know, you are moving with circularity and with sort of even the notion of hybridity is being criticized. But sorry, I'm just having lunch served here. Thank you. But I think that we still need, analytically at least, heuristically, if you want, some kind of social, cultural, ecological, sharper sort of analytical mapping, even if you want to say that they're fluid and permeable, because so we need to know, first, even before that, we need to get a kind of a spatio-temporal framework. I think the paper really needs that. So I was not clear how much of the Sundarbans you're talking about are in Bangladesh, West Bengal, and these places, you know, even if they are far remote places, they are shaped by the regime structures in many respects. And temporarily, I was quite confused about which periods you were referring to. So you begin with, you know, you go back and forth, of course. It's not a chronologically unfolding story, but, you know, you talk a lot about the 16th century, the pre-Islamic as well, and the merging, and or is it a merging, or is it in fact a rewriting? Is it an overscripting, or what is going on here? But we need to get some kind of coherent sort of a temporal narrative as well, right? So for instance, I was confused about the role of what this culture that you're talking about that emerged, the role of the lower classes or lower ranking Brahmins who integrate these figures from folklore. And what are they doing? Are they sort of integrating a kind of Sundarban culture into a larger tradition, and to what extent and how is this? So we need a little more explanation of what is this larger culture that you have a reference to Bengali culture and Durga and so on. But I don't see too much of the Islamic elements there either. And so what is this larger tradition? And when do these guys do this? Sometimes you talk about it during the period of romantic nationalism in the early 20th century or late 19th century. But I just need a little more coherence on this time frame, because after all, we do know that, this period of nationalism, even in Bengal, does produce a lot of communal disharmony, right? And there's the partition of Bengal and so on, which of course is not relevant to the communal divisions, but that does happen. Bengal does get partitioned. Also at the time when all this romantic nationalism presumably is being incorporated, the folklore is being incorporated. So we need a rather more of a socio-historical sort of background to understand what is going on where, right? So I'm speaking really as a traditional historian and recognizing the importance of sort of this kind of context. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to follow your story. Another issue is that I think can be clarified a little, and yeah, I think perhaps Sucheta or Rohan would have been better discussants on this, because although I sort of belong to East India, I'm not that familiar with a lot of the terminology and so on that you use, and sometimes you don't translate, so it becomes sort of harder to read. But I was thinking also about, and it's the great little traditions doesn't help very much at all, because that was denounced even when it was Tamba, I think, wrote about it in the 70s. So that's not the issue, that it's a straw man here. But what is the nature of, and what would be much more interesting is to hear the ecological, even the ecological divisions and how that sort of kind of works out. What is the relationship between agriculture and forest communities? At one point you say that they merge, right? But are there no class structures? Are there no caste differentiations? Does this, so can we not map this at all? We have this amorphous Sundarban culture that is somehow absorbed into the higher levels. I do see the importance of what you're saying, but we just need more delineation. And also, you did point to differentiation between nature and tigers, between forest and agricultural communities. And here you do point to make a very interesting point that Bonabibi shrines are in fact located outside the villages, right? And that's a very interesting, but that's a clue, I think, that can take us further into these issues, right? What does actually differentiate the forest from the village? And another area that I think, especially with Interasia, with the thrust of Interasia, one could do more with, perhaps, and perhaps you'll do that in your book, is the global local, right? The whole Makkah Medina kind of thing, where these notions suddenly show up from. Are they Hajj connections? Are they what kinds of connections? We need more background on how, what is the role of these Sufi fakirs and so on, and how does it keep getting reproduced, and how is this notion sort of seen on the other side, perhaps also? Are there continuities along these coastal areas, which could also be interesting, both to the west and perhaps also to the east? As you know, these are also communities that move into Myanmar and so on. But anyway, Also, just one small element, the use of liminality, I think, is a little problematic, because I think of liminality as a stage, but you seem to sometimes use it as a state, right? That this culture is in a state of liminality. But typically liminality, and that would involve, I want to understand what that means. Because as a stage, where people like Victor Turner and so on would use it to discuss a temporary phase, right? Something that is a liminal moment in ritual or in social transformations and so on, which settle back out from there. But maybe you're trying to say that there's no settling at all. But let me then go back to what, I think is very also interesting in your stuff. I think the story of Bono Bibi and Dokhin Rai, who's the tiger, is a very interesting moral tale, a moral folk tale of good and evil, which centers on an agreement, as it were, with the tiger. I mean, it's almost like they've made a treaty with the tiger on the demarcation of territory, right? And I think that's an idea that you can develop much more earlier and go with that. So there are no, as you say, there's no Bono Bibi shrines in the villages. And it's also fascinating in this connection is the role of the Baulas, the mediators, right? The shamans, I don't know, I don't think you call them shamans, but anyway, they have this very interesting kind of combination of risk to their lives. They show you tiger marks on their bodies. They have rationality, they have local knowledge, right? They can trace pug marks and so on. And magic, which is probably essential for all of that. So I think that's a tale that could be really developed in connection with the story in one more coherent kind of way. The other thing that I find very interesting in your presentation is what happens with conservation and the commercialization of folklore and drama, which you had some very interesting pictures and images as well. You make the interesting argument that in a way these stories become more real, in the sense that they become politicized, right, as they're contested, especially around claims of authenticity and so on. Our version is more authentic than their version, and it comes into a new realm of a competitive, modern competitive sort of claims of authenticity. But at the same time, I think what it does is it produces a new folk tale, right? Because there's a kind of correlative cosmology, which we talk about in Chinese study, where the tiger is seen to respond to the growth of capitalist greed, right? And in a sense, I mean, this is a folk tale, of course, but it has a logic guided by ethics, right? By the ethics. So in a way, they're reinserting the ethics of the necessity of not angering the tiger and understanding it in that kind of way. So it is an interesting spiral that keeps generating and sustaining this kind of thing. So I'll leave it at that. I think that I also had questions about what we need also is to know how much ethnography you've done, what are the different, how you use different sources and different stories and so on. But that we can do later if you find it relevant to discuss now. I mean, today we can do that. So, okay, I think my time is way up. So let's open the floor. Maybe each of you can just respond for a couple of minutes, and just absorb these comments, and we can also have discussion later, and then we'll open it to discussion, or you can raise your responses to other people's questions as well. Did you want to respond for a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Both Yen and you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yen should go first. Yen, you want to?
You go ahead. You go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I responded a little bit just now, so yeah.
So thank you, Prasenjit, for kind of highlighting these very interesting points, which I think needs to be considered because this is just a formative stage of writing this paper. And as you mentioned about the geography, the space where I'm looking at is the eastern part of Bengal. So Bengal was divided into two areas, like one was the drier part, where we have Bardhaman and other places. And there was the other part, which was very close to present day Bangladesh. So that part was kind of more kind of in a way influenced by the trade that was going on, the kind of circulation that was taking place with Chittagong and other ports, which were central towards the circulatory movement. So my focus is on that area, not essentially on the main part of West Bengal, which is currently the Bengal part, where the influence of the Dharma cult, the kind of the Hinduism was more stronger than the littoral part, where we have lots of kind of balladic kind of recitation and kind of development of ideas which were more connected to the aquatic landscape. So my geographical focus is on that landscape, which is more kind of liquid. But you are right to say that it cannot be all ephemeral. There are kind of substantial differentiation within the community. So most of the people who do fishing, who go into the forest, they are essentially they're essentially people who belong to the lower caste or people who are outside the kind of Jati Varna system, so the outcast. And people who are mostly doing kind of peasant farming or kind of doing other forms of craft work, they are at least not outside the kind of the fold of the four varnas. So in a way there is a homogeneity within the communities who go for fishing, who enter the forest for connecting honey and connecting the other forest products, and there is a kind of solidarity, there is a kind of equity within these social groups, which is not existing in the context of peasant societies, where there is a lot of inequalities. There is kind of inequalities in terms of distribution of land, in terms of social hierarchy. So if you look at the forest landscape and the kind of aquatic world, the seafarers, there you don't see that much of discrimination in terms of caste hierarchies, and also to some extent class. But that is not the case with the peasant societies, where there is a lot of differentiation, and there is also kind of disputes between these communities that I mentioned in my paper. So these are some of the issues that I kind of tried to understand. But also the thing that you mentioned about the modern reincarnation of these folk dramatic performances, that needs to be kind of explored in terms of how they kind of adjust to the modernity that is at play, in terms of globalization and in terms of how capital is kind of playing its role in its contemporary context, and how different social groups within these communities contest for a particular space to reclaim their position as being more authentic than the others. So that will be very interesting to kind of explore, which I'm going to explore in my ethnography. So I did field work for nearly 14 months in place which I mentioned in my paper, Gosaba. So the villages surrounding Gosaba, which was kind of established by Daniel Hamilton, a Scottish philanthropist who kind of bought 3 islands in the Sundarban Delta in the 1920s and started inviting people who were landless to kind of occupy this land and kind of till the land free of any kind of rent. But over a period of time, as he left the island, the managers who kind of managed this whole estate, they started being exploitative and kind of rent seeking. So there is a lot of literature in the local archives which talk about the kind of peasant struggle. They also talk about the kind of the growth of Republican Socialist Party. So there is a clear kind of class formation that takes place post 1920. But there are 2 categories again: the people who were dependent completely on the forest, the seafarers, and they were not that much affected by the peasant struggle that was going on in the 1920s. And I've looked into the local archives. So I've done both ethnographic study of the community as well as looked into the kind of archives kept by individual households and local repositories. And also I've also looked into the Dalit literature, which has been published post 1950s, once the Congress Congress came into power, and then the post-Congress, the left front government came into power, and they were kind of promoting this kind of literature, like, for example, little magazines and other forms of pamphleting, which kind of brings out many issues, like, for example, issues of development, issues of progress, and also about other local issues that comes up in this literature. And they also speak about the Dalit agency, because there are a lot of Dalit scholars who have contributed towards writing these.
Okay, well, we don't have, these were just, comments that you absorb, and you can sort of see how it comes out, rather than, in your rewriting, in your final version of it, to see which ones really fit the argument of your paper. So I think that you need to rethink what is the most coherent argument that you can make for a paper here, and tailor the materials accordingly. That's basically the role of this thing. Yeah, but you clearly have a lot of different. So from that perspective, Yen, did you want to respond a little more? You said you had you had done some, but any final comments?
Yeah, I really loved the comments on the boat people. Actually, I personally took a deep interest in that as well, and personally, by looking at the sources, I'm myself confused, and if the people that who took amphibians lifestyle actually are identical to the boat people that has been analyzed extensively. And the boat people, and they are different from the land people, and they are sometimes we change their identities, and it depends on how your neighbor, right, looking at your identity, identifies you. And so there's kind of shifting identities. But the people that I'm talking about, that who took an amphibians lifestyle, that they were used to the land, they used to live on land, they own a house, and they, when the flood happened, and they took on a boat and they make a living by fishing and harvesting aquatic plants. So this kind of identity, I personally, I'm not sure if it's really identified with the boat people that is being analyzed in many other works. So that has been used as a strategy, as ruling strategies, or as people's strategy of evading the taxations as well, and make a living. And for example, and when the flood happened, and so the UN dikes, and so actually the government regulated the height of the dikes, and the dikes should not be constructed too high. And when it was flooded, and people were able to get on a boat and started fishing, and then government were able to just take the revenue based on their fishing, and the people were able to make a living by fishing as well. So it's really a flexible lifestyle in there. And I knew some of the scholars were taking a deep looking at into this kind of shifting lifestyle and their identification of themselves. And but from my perspective, yeah, look particularly in depth in that respect yet.
Okay, questions. I think Sucheta had her hand up at one point. Sucheta? Okay, if not, who are the two participants?
There we are.
Sucheta and then James. Okay. Sucheta, yeah.
Yes.
Quick, huh? Yeah.
So I just wanted to say I was so interested in Debojyoti's paper and the ways in which it made me think back also on the Ngao's paper and areas in which we don't have much communication here, which is that we are leaving out one fundamental part of the landscape when we just say Hindu and Muslim categories. Buddhism, all the different Buddhist groups who are existing on the land, in the borderlands, and that would tie your paper back to Matt King's to some extent. But even in the case of Yen's paper, after all, that whole region is one of the regions which has an inherited history of the Jiangnan, where it was a center of Buddhism going back to the 6th century, the 6th centuries period, and that it has more closer links to Southeast Asia as a result than the later rulers would acknowledge and frame. So that if we did a much more open-ended discussion of religion and local religions, which are part of these cultural worlds, we might find there's this third dimension, namely Buddhism, that books both into the ways in which the peers and the Sufis build and the Sufi belief systems that come out of the syncretic world and Bengal. And on Bengal in particular, especially with the Portuguese period, but even before the Portuguese period, we might want to think about the Habshi, the Ethiopian state really that exists for a while. So that when you show the pictures, the photographs of the people of the Delta, the very presence of the Africans in Bengal has been written out of traditional history. So I think if we are really going to address this question of migration and that adding to the diversities which are positioned in opposition to the mainstream, whether it's Ashrafization, Sanskritization, Hindutva versus Islamization, Saudiization, I call it, because that's a different kind of Islam than the coastal religious practices, and the constant tension of the modern state trying to simplify, package. So in the case of Guangdong, which I know much better, but even in the Jiangnan region, many of the Guanyin images become that of Mary and child, with the deep impressions of Buddhism in Guanyin cult. So that these synthetic, syncretic cultural worlds, which parallel and which not parallel, but which sort of feed into these hybrid peoples, groups who are on the borderlands, who have many folk religious beliefs, who can't really have the same fixed authority figures of the main landed elites. So to give them some agency, in other words.
Okay, we have James.
Well, Prasenjit, thank you. I think that someone was ahead of me. Sanjukta was before me, I think. Oh, okay. Well, I'll raise my questions. Thank you for the two papers to start off our workshop. I had a couple of questions for Yen and then a couple of questions for Debojyoti after that. One for Yen, I was thinking recently I wrote a paper that starts off with the Mongol mobilization of the Danja people, of the Tanka people in the south, prior to their attempted invasion into Southeast Asia, and they mobilized them because of their resources and because they had their cross border, in a sense. They're beyond the Mongols' control, and they have contact in the Southeast Asian states, so therefore they're a useful resource for the Mongols to try to mobilize. But they're also they are a marginal people. Going back to the Song, it certainly was the case too. But I was wondering two things about the marsh areas. I was thinking about Jim Scott's talk on Wednesday at Yale. We're talking about marsh areas as zones of escape, and if there was any way that notion could apply to the Jianghan area. It doesn't sound like it's as neat a fit as it was when I just first thought about it, as you kind of discussed later, but I just was wondering if you saw that the marsh areas as some way space that was kind of an area in which one could escape state control. And the other was the Jiangqi, the miasmic kind of tradition in China, that talking about southern China and Southeast Asia in the early times, Jiangqi literature. There's a lot written in Song sources that builds not just on the actual pestilence of the area, but on a tradition of pestilence that goes beyond the actual effect it had environmentally, that it becomes this trope for not being involved in the South, because the South is a scary place where there's pestilence and we shouldn't be there. I was wondering if going into the Qing period, if there was both a belief that this was going to be a place of disease, and also, of course, the nexus between the actual diseases and what was believed to be the problems of operating there in central China, in the Jianghan area, based on this long tradition of looking at them kind of miasmic, this miasmic trope. Debojyoti, I was wondering at I'll be quick, because I know there's one study that a friend of mine at Riverside, UC Riverside, David Biggs, wrote on the French efforts to drain the Mekong Delta and expand during the colonial period, and its huge impact that it had on local society and impact. And I was wondering if there's parallels between British efforts and French efforts in that kind of colonial way, because this was a later period with even greater technological intervention, because they had these huge dredging machines that they were using by the time the French got there in the 19th century. So I'd wonder if that was there. And then this is just an area where I was wondering, between the Rakhine state in Burma and this region, what connections there might be in terms of tradition, if there are any. And that's just a side of my, I don't know, ignorance. I just was wondering about that. Thank you.
Excellent questions. We'll give the authors a chance later to respond, and especially the comparative thing. I know Yen is talking about Jinghan, and it's about polders and sort of the Genmin and the Han people and so on. It's not Jiangnan at all, and it's certainly not further south. But but I think the comparative dimension would be very interesting here. But I think that Sanjukta wants to say something. Can you also tell us a little bit about yourself, Sanjukta?
Thank you very much for allowing me to question. I just joined the workshop because Debojyoti, who's working with me on a different project, he invited me, and I'm the artistic director of South Asia Institute and an agricultural historian, and my interest is also on borderlands as well as agricultural history. So that's my area of work. Yeah, my question, I'm sorry, Yen, I couldn't hear the full paper, so I don't think I'm in a position to question you, but at another time I shall. So my question is really to Debojyoti, a few observations that I want to draw out here. Firstly, I was sort of, curious about how you're moving between these various colonial officials in your account. Say, for instance, William Hunter, he was into statistics. He was collecting evidence for land revenue, etc. So his silence on Monobibi is not going to be evaluated in terms of how an anthropologist, for instance, would go around mapping forests and looking at religious figures and accounting for those. So similarly, Daniel Hamilton, who is another figure in your account, his aim was also to be focused very much on land tenure and land reclamation and on landed, land assets. So the fact that I'm trying to say here is, these people are still not interested in the kind of communities that are moving between the forest and settled land. So these kind of silences in colonial history has to be looked at from different perspectives as well, rather than just about silences. So that then connects with the initial idea of what the third space is about in your paper. because you want to talk about the third space. And this third space is constantly either imagined in a different way in colonial times because it didn't exist. It was all about the wilderness of the Sundarbans and the need to connect to a revenue yielding landed land project, which is what the Sundarban area was all about. But again, colonial official like Guru Shada Dotto, who again figures in your account, is a different species altogether. You know, he's a civil servant, and he has, again, a project for collecting folklores. And he was very much behind collecting folklores at a time when it became fashionable to actually collect these folklores, sanitize them, and repackage them for an urban audience. So, you know, his agenda is again very different as to how he would portray Bonavibi or the forest dwellers or the idea of how the Sundarban should be imagined. So the imagination of Sundarban goes through various phases, even during the colonial period that you're referring to. And that makes it even more interesting to reflect on whether there was actually a third space produced then, which I think it did, because this is exactly what Guru Shada Dotto did. He collected the folklore, he repackaged it for a different audience, and he produced a third folklore, which is outside the hybrid model that you're talking about, greater tradition, little tradition, religion that is mainstream Hindutva or Hinduism, compared to the more folklorist elements of deities. So I think it's quite important that when you're mapping these various agencies who are reflecting on this area, to then plow it back to what kind of third space that is initially in your head when you're conceptualizing as well. So that's all I wanted to say, but you might have some reflections on that. Thank you.
Excellent. Those are very fascinating, important points. So now we're out of time, but we should give our two presenters a chance to respond briefly to all of these questions.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks, James, for the questions. And let's start with the miasmatic condition in the Jianghan Plan. There are a lot of missionary accounts about miasmatic conditions in the Jianghan Plan. And in the 18th, 19th century, and there are especially missionary descriptions of the local conditions of the wetland, and the local hospitals especially treated patients who were having leprosy. And they attributed the leprosy as kind of conditions and how many patients, and every year they were sick, and just due to the miasmatic conditions of the Jianghan Plan. And for that, actually, I especially mentioned about the horse, and the horse couldn't stand the wetness and the humidity of the region. And that is one part of it, and especially for the annually 40 to 60 inches of rainfall, and that has caused a lot of drainage problems in this region as well. So, the other one? Oh, about James Scott's lecture. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to catch that lecture, so I was not able to. And you have to refresh me about the ideas. But I did reference James Scott's work in my writing, that especially when agricultural and agrarian states try to incorporate and settle people, and so that they can incorporate into the state system as a governance and ruling, and so that they could be registered in the taxation system, enable the tax and increase the revenue. So I did reference his work in that respect. I don't know about that. Probably I will just quickly respond these two, and I will give the floor to Dr. Das. Yeah, please.
Thank you, James and Sanjukta, for asking this very interesting question. Yeah, there is a kind of comparative study that we can do, because if you look at the Sundarban Delta and if you compare it with Southeast Asia. There was more advanced form of dredging that was taking place in the Mekong River Delta. But even in the Sundarbans, they were building embankments, they were building polders, which kind of helped in kind of, reclaiming the land from the marshy parts of the delta. And that kind of created or destabilized the whole ecological spaces. With regards to your the other question that you raised in terms of communication between Myanmar and the Bengal Delta in terms of mobility of population, there are several accounts, and in fact there has been several phases in which people have moved. Like I discovered the Rakhine community in Patuakhali, which is very close to the Sundarban Delta, where people had migrated, the hill people from the Rakhine state had migrated in the 18th century, and they were given land by the Britishers, so they became landholders, the gentry, landholding gentry in the 19th century. And in the current context, there is a huge conflict between the indigenous Rakhine communities, and they are actually migrating to Chittagong hill tracts, like the Rakhines are migrating to Bangladesh. And there is also this account that I saw when I was doing archival research in the Sundarban, and there are many accounts which talk about the Mog pirates who migrated from the lower Burma to the Sundarbans, and they would kind of terrorize the local peasants, and they would kind of carry on these raids into the local community. So that was very much active. In fact, in one of the accounts that I read, during Hamilton's zamindari, after independence, there was this claim to kind of give these Mog settlers permanent settlement in the Sundarban, particularly in Gosaba, where I did my fieldwork. So there are several accounts. Now coming to Sanjukta's question, I think it's very important, as you have mentioned, to give the different perspectives that these different individuals or kind of state officials were playing their role, like for example Guru Shodhar Datta, or for example Rennell and Hunter, who kind of mapped this landscape. But what I'm trying to kind of understand through this paper is this whole classification that has been done between the folk and the non-folk, that the kind of mainstream culture. I think that is slightly problematic, because we cannot kind of compartmentalize these two categories. And definitely Guru Shodhar Datta at that point of time kind of reinvented the folk by presenting it to the urban classes and also to the global kind of audience. Like if you look at the Potachitras, and they were kind of mostly transferred to the Victoria and Albert Museum. There is more understanding of Potachitras in Europe than in the local context. People don't give much value. Only in the present context we have some model villages coming up because of the intervention of the state government and kind of developmental grants given to people living in Noya and other places in West Bengal. But in the local context, the Potachitrakars have been marginalized. They have kind of dual identity, being both a Muslim name, they've had their Hindu name, and their kind of relevance in society is quite remote, in the sense that they don't kind of get much employment because of the activities that they do. So I think the point that you have raised with regards to Guru Shodhar Datta's kind of intervention in the early 20th century is important, because he was product of that new enlightenment, like he was part of that administration, and he did kind of create a new genre which are distinct from the local genre of understanding folk and understanding local cultural practices. And I think that perspective also needs to be foregrounded. But I think colonial officials who were working in this area, whether they were statistician or just collecting data, they in a way maybe kind of they had their own agency of what they wanted to represent, because they always wanted to create these binaries, the different categories. So I think that also we need to kind of focus on, I feel. Yeah.
Okay, well, we have only just taken 13 minutes over time, and that is excellent in the way we manage this despite all the disruptions. But I want to thank you all for the conclusion of this first day of this event, of this workshop, and let's give a hand to both of our speakers for having presented some very interesting material. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, see you later.
Thank you. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
10 a.m. EST. Okay, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.